My name is Sam Ortega-Kosai, and I'm a graduate student here in the Department of Sociology in our School of Social Policy. It is my pleasure to be a discussant for the Sexual Health and Behaviors panel. Queer health, and queer sexual health in particular, has a deep history that is riddled with stigma and ambiguity. Queer people are also marginalized when it comes to accurate representation in health data and healthcare spaces. Today, it is my pleasure to introduce our three panelists who are reimagining what it means to study queer health and fundamentally changing what sexual health and behavior research is. I'd like to first introduce Jamie Budnick. She is an assistant professor of sociology at Cornell University. She studies the social construction of sexuality knowledge. Her work has also focused on reproductive health, intimate partner violence, and social survey measures, as well as sexual identity. Next, I'd like to introduce Terrell Winder. Terrell is an assistant professor of sociology at the University of California, Santa Barbara. As an urban ethnographer, Dr. Winder's current research examines sexual wellness in the biomedical age, as well as stigma response processes among stigmatized populations who are simultaneously negotiating more than one stigma. Last but not least, I'd like to introduce Thuai No. Thuai currently serves as the Vice President of Social and Behavioral Science Research at Population Council and is the founding director of the Girl Innovation Research and Learning Center, also at Population Council. Dr. No's research areas focus on sexual and reproductive health, HIV and AIDS, COVID-19, health equity, gender norms and equality, violence and poverty alleviation.
All right, thank you for having me. The time has come. We are together for a full day of queer demography, and I know that everyone here in this room and attending online recognizes that this is a special meeting. Many of us have been outsiders across multiple intellectual spaces in our careers. I have felt too empiricist in my women's studies classes, my women's studies college major, excited by research design and going around calling my qualitative interview data. I felt too queer among family demographers, holding fiercely to the commitment to study the very same people that we made invisible on our surveys. I'm going to conclude with an optimistic vision of the next generation of population scientists, but I will start by telling you with concern why the time has come. My title adapts the first sentence of Gail Rubin's influential 1984 article, Thinking Sex, Notes for a Radical Theory of the Politics of Sexuality, one of the founding texts of sexuality studies and queer theory. I want to read her opening paragraph in full, written about a world exactly 40 years ago. The time has come to think about sex. To some, sexuality may seem to be an unimportant topic, a frivolous diversion from the more critical problems of poverty, war, disease, rape, famine, or nuclear annihilation. But it is precisely at times such as these, when we live with the possibility of unthinkable destruction, that people are likely to become dangerously crazy about sexuality. Contemporary conflicts over sexual values and erotic conduct have much in common with the religious disputes of earlier centuries. They acquire immense symbolic weight. Disputes over sexual behavior often become the vehicles for displacing social anxieties and discharging their attendant emotional intensity. Consequently, sexuality should be treated with special respect in times of great social stress. So clearly, this could have been written today. I believe that queer demography can be part of the response to these times of great social stress. Today, I want to raise particular issues about surveying sexuality that are methodological, theoretical, and political in scope. In the past, when I've raised these issues, I get bifurcated responses. Some demographers are quick to minimize them or defend the status quo, while my gender studies audiences might not be able to see beyond what they experience as the violence of the checkbox. But I believe this can be a space that we might hold both responses together and imagine a way forward. So I want to focus our attention on the survey questionnaires that generate so much of the data that make our work possible. These surveys simultaneously reflect and shape the world they measure. We collect data from respondents, but the survey instrument also teaches them about sexuality. It is both explicitly and implicitly instructive. I'm interested in seeing the collective body of social surveys as a data source, an archive. This corpus has stories to tell. From it, we can learn how survey data about sexuality are typically collected, what questions it was possible to ask, and what it was possible to learn from the resulting information. The flip side is the analysis can reveal what is eclipsed, what is impossible to know, what we still have to fight for if we value it. I'm going to share some highlights from my historical research on the development of what we might call today queer demography, and propose a set of productive problems from existing survey questionnaires that I believe this room is uniquely situated to address. Some of the ideas and examples that I'll discuss today come from my dissertation and book project, which looks at the social lives of sexuality statistics, examining how population science shapes people and politics, and vice versa. I will also draw from a paper published in Sexualities, written with my co-authors Laurel Westbrook and Aaliyah Saperstein. In this collaboration, we conducted a content analysis examining how sexuality appeared across 6 decades of surveys in the United States, 4 predominant national social surveys, and 5 specialty surveys. We collected all the English language questionnaires, codebooks, interviewer instructions, and user guides for all of these surveys, and extracted and coded anything about sexuality. We find when surveying sexuality, population scientists overwhelmingly focus on the charmed circle of sexuality. This is an influential concept from Gail Rubin's Thinking Sex paper. Surveys largely focus on heterosexual, married, monogamous, and potentially procreative sex. This is what Foucault calls the authorized vocabulary of sexuality. Yes, discourse of sex proliferates, but it adheres to rules about what can be said, where, and why. When sexuality concepts toward the outer limits of the charmed circle did arise, they did so within a frame of risk, of vulnerability to sexually transmitted diseases, gendered violence, pregnancy risk, or health disparity. And this totally makes sense given that a new era of demography of sexuality arose out of the AIDS epidemic. In the intervening 4 decades, sexuality researchers have found health to be a very successful frame, legitimizing and sanitizing what might be otherwise considered dirty work. The sexual health frame has taken off globally and has made it possible to secure funding for research that would have been unimaginable otherwise conceived. No doubt the Lauman study's storied loss of congressional funding was a cautionary tale to the researchers who had designed the wildly successful federally funded study that we know by the shorthand AdHealth. This has tremendous consequences for what it is possible to ask and to know about sexuality from surveys. Health is important, but the frame is so total that it can be oppressive and limiting. Funding agencies have to walk a fine line between lifting up and denigrating the people it designates a population at risk. And scholars have to unpack the unintended legacies of statistics constructed from these data. I'm going to walk through 3 examples from my archival analysis of survey questionnaires that have a clear demographic logic behind them, but that ultimately may circumscribe our sexuality knowledge. My goal in analyzing these 3 examples is to pose them as productive problems and to use the space of this summit to appreciate why we did things in the past and imagine together how we might do things differently going forward. The 3 examples are other, please specify, or those fill in the blank response options, introductory statements, which prime participants for new content, and third, SAQ or sections that are self-administered, ultra-confidential sections on survey questionnaires. So I want to make an argument for retaining those open response options when possible. How we ask questions about identity categories on surveys, as anywhere else in life, is going to evolve as the way we think about identity evolves. These simultaneous evolutions can give insight into one another. In this section, I look at the evolution of a single survey item. Since 2002, the National Survey of Family Growth, or NSFG going forward, has included questions on sexual orientation. This makes it one of the first national surveys to do so. It was earlier than other similar studies, even those specializing in topics related to sex. The long-running repeat panel design of the NSFG is especially helpful because not only can researchers compare trends in response rates over time, we can also look at changes to those questions themselves. Analyzing change over time can provide insight into researcher priorities and disciplinary norms, reveal trade-offs made along the way, and contextualize the resulting aggregate statistics. Interesting, I didn't think this part would work, yay. The first version of the NSFG sexual orientation question had 4 response options: heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, and something else. This is how the questions appeared the first time that they were asked. The most common responses to the question was heterosexual. Nearly as many men and women chose something else for sexual identity as homosexual and bisexual combined. In other words, this something else was the most popular non-heterosexual response by far. This statistic aligns with insights from theoretical and qualitative work on sexuality, finding that queer folks reject labels, use creative or personal identity labels, or generally find it challenging to check a box to describe their sexuality. However, it could have been an artifact of a problem with the question or response options, that is, the labels that were provided, which could be adjusted or to investigate, there were 2 major changes made to subsequent versions, to the subsequent version. The next iteration of the question included a follow-up for anyone who selected that popular other something else option. The next iteration asked, when you say something else, what do you mean? Please type in your answer. The version also adds more commonly known vernacular terms for sexuality like gay, lesbian, and straight. Researchers then back-coded the something else verbatim responses into the first 3 categories whenever possible. The National Health Statistics Report Methods Appendix notes that their staff did this conservatively, but readers are left only with a table summarizing the changes and perhaps several questions. The percent of respondents choosing something else was higher for women than for men, and note here that the NSFG used binary measurement, sex, gender. I consider this particularly notable, given that we see that women ostensibly had an additional label to choose from, lesbian, among the response options, yet more women either struggled or refused to identify with one of the existing labels. Women are also more likely to identify as bisexual. Does this reflect something about women's sexuality or with women's engagement with questions about their sexuality? We do not know the answer to this question. We could learn more by adding qualitative investigation to the work of backcoding. What we might learn from that qualitative work would inform both the practice of asking questions and cleaning the data and the theories we form based on that data. Ultimately, NSFG researchers determined that backcoding did not significantly alter their findings, and for this reason, in combination with, quote, the survey costs associated with the follow-up question, that is, cleaning those typed in answers, the something else was deleted altogether. In subsequent versions, through today, respondents must choose between these 3 options or refuse to answer. So on the one hand, the technical reports about the data are incredibly detailed and illuminating. On the other hand, there is still arguably a great degree of black boxing the actual processes behind the many tabulations presented. Researcher decisions and actions are linguistically presented in a way that obscures the actor. For example, responses were backcoded, and verbatim responses exemplifying these decisions are cherry-picked. Who made these decisions, how, and why? So NSFG staff did it, to be sure, but were they also members of the categories they were constructing? Could actual respondents have been consulted as they are in cognitive interviewing, pre-testing, focus groups? This might reflect how straightforward and unambiguous these backcoded something else responses were deemed to be, and the relative significance of the problem presented by so few people. So does it matter? This human element, the actor behind the work, is obscured, and the reader and the end user of the data has no way of judging for themselves. This is a limitation that renders these data completely invalid to some non-demographer sexuality scholars. This evolution and erasure of the something else response option over time exemplifies some of the norms and challenges in survey research, including the desire to have mutually exclusive categories, collapsing infrequently occurring responses, the reluctance to invite participants to write in their answer, and the black boxing of processes to clean and order the data. These practices push against contemporary sexualities theory, challenging such neatly bounded models of sexuality. This matters to some researchers more than others. Some might be sufficiently satisfied after reading the National Health Statistics reports and user guides that they accept what has been done and then analyze and publish from the data meant for the end user. But especially for a fast-changing social concept like sexuality is today, we must remember that decisions that erase these options lock in for all future researchers what we can ever learn from the data. Others might maintain so many questions and objections that they simply refrain from using survey data like these at all. Such different judgments contribute to dichotomies between queer, humanistic, and social scientific approaches to studying sexuality. Ultimately, this example shows how the culture of demography can push against making knowledge in the respondents' own terms. It also shows how respondents refused the researchers' categories. What are we to do? I'd like to consider retaining the something else and the please specify option whenever possible. I take a cue from others working in this area that this is the right approach. I want to mention two examples. Joel Middleman's, hello, on the online, careful and convincing analysis of the respondents who change their answers over time shows that there is more signal than noise in the something else option. And that when it comes to analyzing disparities, the something else folks are more like the other queer categories than they are like the straight category. And another, Amanda Baumley and Delane Compton's qualitative research published in JMF reveals the fraught significance of selecting among closed response options for LGBTQ parents when describing their families. There's a reason the other please specify option is particularly evocative to the queer methods community. When it comes to its inclusion in surveys of sexual identity, the time has come to make this standard practice. The next example of a productive problem is introductory statements. And I'm sure we're keeping these, no fight necessary. These statements help transition survey respondents between sections, preparing them for a shift in content, but also doing all sorts of heavy lifting around priming participants to be open-minded and forthcoming. These statements are heightened moments of explicit transmission of values and norms, though they often seek to be as neutral as possible on their face. With this example, I just want to draw our attention to these points in surveys and make sure they are accomplishing what we want them to, and that we understand their multiple competing consequences and potential legacies. The sexual orientation question I discussed previously in the NSFG is immediately preceded by a question on sexual attraction, which includes an example of this kind of normalizing introductory statement. Quote, people are different in their sexual attraction to other people. Survey content on sexuality is often preceded by an explanation of why respondents are being asked in the first place, a defense of the topic so they understand the purpose of the intrusion into their private lives. The top example from the National Sexual Health Survey reads, the next section asks about different sexual activities. Again, all your answers are confidential. It is important for us to ask these questions of everyone so we can find out how many people are or are not at risk for AIDS in the United States. Motivated by the same logic, but with more potent language. So that was 1996. Motivated by the same logic, but with more potent language, the introductory statement immediately preceding the GSS's sexual orientation question reads, there's a great deal of concern today about the AIDS epidemic and how to deal with it. Because of the grave nature of the problem, we are going to ask you some personal questions and we need your frank and honest responses. Your answers are confidential and will only be used for statistical reports. This specific statement and ordering appeared in 2010, over 2 decades after the height of the AIDS panic. I want to emphasize that there's an obvious empathic and demographic logic to these kinds of intro statements. They help walk the research participant through the survey and know what to expect. They minimize missing data and seek to maximize respondent comfort and honesty. But here's an explicit use of the health frame as justifying, legitimizing, sanitizing. Researchers obtain compliance with funders, IRB approval, and response rates. And yet, perhaps the time has come to stop inevitably tying sexual orientation to risk, disease, epidemic, and shame. Which brings me to the third example, the use of the self-administered questionnaires or audio computer-assisted self-interviewing sections of surveys. They're often called slight variations of these, so I'll just refer to them as SAQs. Sexual questions of all types have traditionally appeared in these separate, ultra-private and ultra-protected sections of the survey questionnaire. Institutional review boards expect us to put them there, and downstream researchers must obtain special permission to gain access to these data. For these parts of the survey study, the interviewer would interrupt the question and answer conversational dynamic and hand over headphones or a computer so that the participant could respond in private. These sections would be introduced by stating, as in this example from the NSFG, something like, now let's talk about some things that you may have experienced in your life. We know that these questions are about things you may not think about or talk about often. These things may be difficult to remember and some are personal. Because this information is very important, please take as much time as you need and read the questions and put your answers into the computer in complete privacy. Your interviewer will never know how you answer and will not ask you any questions about your answers. This statement encourages the respondent to take their time, answer honestly, and rest assured that their answers are private and protected. While this makes sense from the well-intentioned goal of protecting research subjects, we actually know that asking about sexuality in general does not increase attrition or missing data. People are generally happier to answer questions about sex than money. The placement in the SAQ makes it more likely that question ordering is an additional priming issue. The NSFG sexuality questions appear in a self-administered section called Sexual Attraction, Orientation, and Experience with STDs. And the Ad Health questionnaire appear in a section called, and this one is Ad Health, Suicide, Sexual Experiences, and Sexually Transmitted Diseases. Indeed, for many respondents, all of these topics would feel sensitive and warrant being asked in a separate, more private mode. It is also important to consider the inadvertent effects of the SAQ system. Treating sexuality questions as sensitive is also instructive and performative. It confers the information that these questions are somehow different than the others asked previously, directly with the interviewer, and that researchers expect the average person would feel and respond differently toward them. But the effects of the SAQ system begin before the research encounter with IRB and funding expectations and extend beyond it. These data are typically restricted from public use files, available only to researchers with institutional affiliation or after registering that they're going to use the data. And even then, small N categories are collapsed and verbatim responses are almost never made available. Again, follows a clear demographic logic and yet. So I simply want to ask if the time has come to reconsider the ubiquitous use of the SAQ. Could we imagine asking these sexuality questions in the demographic section? Mm-hmm. Here quickly are a couple more ideas that my book and our paper go into, but I can't cover in depth here. I'd love us to be willing to change response options to keep up with changing times and experiment with language that opens possibilities and disrupts stereotypes. So here I'm specifically critiquing traditional language that often positions men as active and women as passive in sex, and that assumes men are perpetrators and women are victims in violence. That kind of language is all over survey questionnaires. Let's ask about more than one partner. All of these surveys collect partner data on one person after a complex identification process. Don't have to read the whole thing to get the gist of the complexity, narrowing down to one person. Questions about multiple partners are usually normatively negative about cheating. And critically, ask about pleasure, feelings of satisfaction, sources of joy. So in conclusion, the Queer Demography Summit is uniquely situated to take up these productive problems. I continue to be motivated by the understanding that surveys reflect and shape the world they measure. We do not simply passively collect data. We are also teaching respondents and enabling or foreclosing types of knowledge about the social world. The time has come to move beyond reifying sex negativity with our measurement models or couching our questions in the safe paradigm of sexual health. We have other legacies to draw upon. Even a contemporary model taking Kinsey as a touchstone might be less concerned with risk and disparities and more invested in documenting the spectacular variation in human experience. I said I'd end on a really optimistic note, and I want to do that. Last summer, I presented similar productive problems to a room full of college juniors, mostly students historically underrepresented in PhD programs. The Next Gen POP program exposes them to demography, connects them to mentors, and encourages attending PAA, the Population Association of America. Maybe it's confirmation bias, but it felt to me over that lunch that a quarter of the folks in the room were queer identified or inspired by queer politics. They were chomping at the bit to tackle problems like these. So I believe their time has come. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Terrell Winder. Happy to be with you all today. I'm kind of waking up, coming from, of course, California. Today, thanks to Christopher for inviting me. We were talking earlier because I remember being invited and being like, okay, I don't really know if I do demography, but I'm happy to come and talk about something, that I do. So today I'm going to talk about my work around sexual health behaviors among Black sexual minority groups. Mostly my work is focused in Los Angeles, New Orleans, but also some work beyond. And fundamentally, I think the question that I'm pondering and posing in this space is kind of what do we want people to take away from our demography, right? Like what do we want people to think about when they hear some of the statistics and the things that come out of these projects? And so something I'm thinking about is like how are mental health and sexually transmitted diseases discussed among Black sexual minority Americans? And then three sub-questions of that being what impact do various life experiences and social institutions have on mental health and on sexual health? How are statistics and quantitative data impacting social perception of health, primarily among Black gay men, which I focus on? And how does the local framing of sexual and mental health affect the behaviors and the life outlook of Black gay men? So most of my work is focused kind of on this conceptualization about stigma, and so how groups are navigating multiple sets of stigma. One of the things that I think has come up throughout many of the presentations today is that a lot of the demographic work has focused on this question about epidemics, right, in health. And I made a very conscious decision in my work not to talk about HIV stigma, and not to focus on that, because anytime I said I studied Black gay men, everyone said, oh, you study HIV. And I did not in graduate school. But now I do because of that, but I'll come to that. But fundamentally, the question became, what does it mean when you're navigating not just race-based stigma, but sexuality-based stigma, or we might consider intersectional axes around stigma, right? So when those are combined. And a lot of my work kind of problematizes how we think about these as separate groups. So historically, of course, the Goffman text stigma, notes on the management of a spoiled identity is kind of the launching point for how I think about my own work in stigma. And I kind of project out what I call unspoiling, or this other category of way to think about what would it mean if our identities were not perpetually sources of stigma or shame. And so positioning what my current book project about what I theorize as unspoiling between these ideas around covering and passing as options for how to respond to stigma. And then this larger question about, is social destigmatization even a thing? And if so, what would it look like, right? I'm drawing on primarily multiple studies that I've conducted or things that I've thought about over time. And so the first one is where my book project is focused on about Los Angeles. So I spent 4 years doing ethnographic participant observation at a community organization in Los Angeles. I went to weekly support group meetings, birthday parties, balls in the house ballroom community, brunches, clubs. I was with them kind of everywhere. I also did interviews with 50 self-identified Black, gay, or pansexual young men. And part of why I use the term gay rather than queer is because that is the term that they use, right? And they talk about being part of a gay community, but kind of rejected the idea of queer. Now, to be fair, during this time, I was in grad school, so it was like with 2012-ish to maybe 2016, 17, when I was finishing up my ethnographic work. Those groups of folks were between the ages of maybe 18 and 30. And so they'd grown up with more negative attitudes towards words like queer, felt that they were stigmatizing and problematic. As part of that project, in addition to this, I also look at queer media, so shows like Noah's Ark or other web series, so how those have changed what Black queer life looks like, and also how chosen family networks impact how people understand their social behaviors and identities. I also started a project in 2019 in New Orleans, and I've done about 5 months or so of participant observation with varying levels of success because of the different social nature of New Orleans. I've been to clubs, different birthday parties, different festivals like Mardi Gras, Zulu Ball, Super Sunday. I did about 20 interviews pre-pandemic with Black, bisexual, gay, and pansexual men. The pandemic happened, then restrictions were lifted, so we could go back, but then California had this rule that you couldn't go to half of the country because of laws that they put in place for any state that had enacted a law prohibiting gay rights or queer rights, right? Which meant that some of us couldn't even study the populations that we were trying to study for other reasons. But now I've been able to go back, so I'm working on that as well. When I pivoted from that project because I could not go back to New Orleans, I instead started a different project to think a little bit about what I call the African Traditional Religion Project. And so this is based on some of the Pew research that talks about how Black Americans historically have been more religious, but among Black Gen Z and millennial groups, they started to identify somewhat as either religiously non-affiliated or into other religious groups. And one of those groups are people who are trying to practice African traditional religions or African diasporic religions. So I did 109 interviews with self-identified Black ATR practitioners who were all millennial or Gen Z, all on Zoom, recorded kind of between May 2022, June 2023. And they were recruited from with a community collaborator who does a podcast called A Little Juju. And we kind of snowballed, sampled from there. And of course, the interviews were between 45 minutes to 2.5 hours for each one. What's important about this group is it was open to anyone who identified as Black and also part of that millennial or Gen Z group. The vast majority of them, 25% identify as heterosexual. The rest all identify as queer or some variation of that, or multiple terms. I can get into the messiness of that later. And then maybe 13 or 14 people, or maybe 12% identified as cisgender men, and the rest identify as agender, cis women, or something else, right? And so it really does focus on sexually minoritized groups. So I'll be pulling from all of these main studies that I've conducted as part of this. Other studies I've worked on, Healthy Selfie project that I did in graduate school with a colleague of mine in social welfare and a mentor that looked at focus groups between HIV positive and negative Black young men who have sex with men. So discussing the usefulness of mobile health applications for managing health. And then also an article called Getting Prepared for HIV Prevention, where we did dyad interviews with Black young men who have sex with men to talk about how do friends talk about PrEP and PEP in their communities. So my arguments are kind of based around this kind of subset of ideas. So one, I'll talk about mental health, and I break that down into racial-based stigma, sexuality stigma, and then talk about this overlapping question about like how does spirituality play in, especially with the ATR project. And then turning to this idea about sexual health, what does it mean to frame our studies in the sexual health terminology and how are people taking that on? What does that mean for the communities that we're actually studying? So first, one of the major findings that I like to focus on here is just how are stigmas being discussed and taken up by communities. So first, there were a lot of race-based stigmas, and what you may notice about them is here are the ones that came up the most. So notions that Black people are thieves or threats of violence, terms like ghetto, high school dropout, not intelligent, dumb. The one thing that was true in my studies about the negative things that people had heard about their racial identity was that it was much more varied. So there were less repetition among folks because they'd heard many different things in the study. I break up, though, the sexuality-based stigmas into two categories, one being secular and the other being religious. So for the secular ones, right, they heard classic words we see all the time, but also primarily the large one here, you'll get HIV and AIDS or some kind of disease, right? So this disease terminology or this focus on that is fundamentally there. Gay is not okay or not right or wrong, right? Which I classified as secular rather than the as we'll get to in the religious part, because there's a cultural expectation around that rather than perhaps the moral one that we're thinking about. Now, the sexuality-based ones, of course, the biggest one here that came up all the time was you're going to hell, right? Which we know if any of us grew up, as Gary said, wanting to be a priest. I wanted to be the Pope when I was a young Catholic. But I will say, yes, heard it all the time, right? That an abomination, it's a sin, it's against God, eternal damnation, all of those things, right? So these are very common things that were heard, right? So I became fundamentally interested in, okay, what does that mean in Los Angeles, and how do people navigate hearing this all the time, and how do they kind of push forward from that? In addition, in New Orleans, what became very clear is they were hearing similar things, but they talked about some of the ways that people struggled to address things that they thought were very important. So one person said, you know, we're really good at socializing with each other, but there are some real issues, or not issues, but that our community doesn't galvanize. So whether that's domestic violence, or poverty, which is a major Black issue in New Orleans, or HIV and AIDS or STDs, which New Orleans has always been of the highest, areas. So many of the folks in New Orleans talked about the difficulty with addressing these topics because they felt like they didn't have a space to do that, or that they weren't coming up in the types of conversations they were. Now, of course, as I like to say, these projects that I've been doing are kind of different because in LA, there were community organizations where I was going to meetings that were fundamentally being funded by NSF, NIH, CDC to run these community health DEBI programs. So HIV was always in the background, right? But the question is, how much of a role does it play in just natural conversation and when people are engaged in social space? Some of the other examples that people said were, I know there have been a few suicides, or a couple of them, and that people have had experiences, associations with those folks, but it was a small community. They didn't have a place to talk about it or to address it. Someone else said, there are so many facets of ways people can, contribute to suicidal thoughts or ideologies or attempts in the community, but we don't talk about those things if they're having a hard time. And again, here someone says, if someone's struggling to make ends meet, or someone has a disease that they're having a hard time with, just in general, or being abused, people who live in our community will never know because we don't carry the signs, right? So this question about how do we find out who is struggling with these issues and who isn't, especially in communities where people don't want to talk about them. Finally, in this part about mental health, it also led me in the ATR project to start to think about, okay, you've grown up in this church experience being told you're gay, you're going to hell. So what does that mean? For some people, that meant they needed to, as they said, decolonize their relationship with religion. So they've gone back to practicing ATR practices. And they talk about how important it has been for their mental health and their wellness. So one respondent says, so I think hoodoo allows me to just exist. I feel like when I wasn't in hoodoo, I would either get uncomfortable that I was being too masculine in terms of my energy. So here's someone who talks about struggling with the boundaries around masculinity and femininity and gender, and how hoodoo helps them to do that. Someone else says, hoodoo is like I needed it. I needed hoodoo to provide comfort in ways I was never able to receive. And when it comes to mental health, especially in Black Christian households or Black churchy households, the idea is to just pray it away because mental health is perceived as the devil. So mental health and religion go hand in hand. But what I found in this project is that while we cast many other places, especially I think a lot of the discourse about Africa in general has been always considered backwards. Even the use of the term traditional, someone was talking to me about recently, like, should I say traditional religion because it notes its cast of the past in some way. That people, Black Americans in particular, are finding ways to liberate themselves from what they feel like are the confines of Black Christianity or Christianity in our particular society, to go back to other types of practices. Someone else said, being an ancestral witch has made it almost impossible for me to not really focus and be intentional in their mental health. So they said their religious practice has instead helped them to focus on mental health now. And this person also said that mental health and magic go hand in hand. And I feel like that's another layer. It's my work, another layer of support and encouragement, right? So this question of magic, which is always now at the forefront of my mind, like, what does that mean when we say this, right? Finally, on the second half, I want to think a little bit about sexual health, right, in the framing of what it is. And here I talk about kind of the local HIV approach. So in Los Angeles, there was a local HIV approach. I was on the Los Angeles County the Los Angeles County Commission on HIV while I was in graduate school. They needed someone who was one, I guess, in the primary age group they were focused on, but also I was one of the only Black people who was Black and queer within the main group that everyone was focused on at the time. And one of the things that came up a lot being on that body was this idea about community viral load, right? And the focus was, we're going to focus less on prevention of people who are not HIV negative and instead funnel most of the resources into folks who are HIV positive and getting them on ART, right? So to lower the community viral load became the primary approach. And one of the issues is they sent out someone to come and talk about the HIV comprehensive plan to the community site I was in, and they brought together a bunch of organizations, and this person came in with basically the equivalent of this. You all have no idea what this document says or what it is. It's 163 pages. And they came in and said, well, basically the goal now is to lower the community viral load so less people contract HIV. What do you all think about that plan? And of course, as you all are here, you're like, you've never read it. And I was sitting there as someone like, you brought together like 35 Black gay men from Los Angeles in this age group, and you told them that there's a plan, and that's all you said. No pamphlets. I have even more information because I have a PowerPoint. They didn't have that. And so it became very clear to me that this was a moment where I had to say, no one can actually weigh in on what this plan is, because I'm sure there's more than 100, has to be more information than what you're sharing with us in a 163-page document. But it came very clear to me that a lot of what we do is to get buy-in from community without actually giving them the information about what they need to know and why they need to know, right? And so many of them said, I mean, well, it sounds good if you put it that way. Like, yes, sounds like we won't get it. But they actually have no real sensibility about how to take what they're learning. When we talked about this, so like actually being counted and what it means, many of the folks in my project talked a lot about fear around getting tested, right, and being counted, right, because they're afraid of who might find out. So I think it flows directly, constantly as we're thinking. What does it mean to have privacy in answering these questions? And how is it meaningful? One of the strategies from the LA County at the time was to say, if someone doesn't answer something, or if we need to know someone falls out of care, we're going to send a community health worker to their door and to get them back in care, force them back into HIV care. And one person was like, absolutely not. Lori, who was one of the workers at the time, said, so what would you all do if someone falls out of care? What would you do to fix it? And one of the young men said, I wouldn't stick the county on them, right? So this idea of the county, these bodies, these community health bodies, people feel like they're constantly at war with these communities because they're not part of them, right? So if you're living in a place and someone who you don't know comes to your door and talks to you about community health things, it's a problem, right? You feel like they call them the HIV police, right, in my project. And so what does that mean? And are we the HIV police if we conduct our projects in the way that we do? So with that, I want to think finally about kind of what is the power of statistics or the demography that we do in this. And in my work, one of the things that came up a lot was work that came out of the Black AIDS Institute. And they had a study that came out in 2012 called Back of the Line, the State of AIDS Among Black Gay Men in America. And they published work talking about some of the chances that you have. And many of the young people in my project saw this and they read this and they took this as saying basically by the time they were 35, they had a 1 in 2 chance of getting HIV. And so we publish this kind of work, we do this. And then the question I always have is, okay, as someone who is Black and gay as part of this population and in that age group at that time, and currently, yeah, I'll be 35 this year. But still thinking about this, right, as a larger circle, many people said, I think that HIV risk is always in the back of my mind. And I told a friend this, I rarely admit, because I do feel like we're all destined to get HIV one day. It's bound to happen. We're just waiting for it to happen. And so it's very negative because it's always in the back of my head and I'm always fighting that. So the way we publish data and the things we put out into community often go unfiltered, right? We publish these studies maybe for each other, but then the people who actually have been studied and had their information collected don't often get a chance to say, how do I take this and what does this mean to me? One of the things that came up in the discussion of this project or in this report is someone who said, okay, well, how do we use prevention strategies? Well, someone says, well, I hate to say it, but maybe we need to stop having sex with other Black men. So it became this question of, is this a way to argue for interracial relationships? Or maybe the strategy is to, leave each other alone kind of thing. I don't know that that's what we intend when things are published. Maybe things for us to think about. I will say, in closing here, for me at least, why I focus and do qualitative data, I like to say I haven't opened data in about a decade, and we'll see if that changes in the future. But for me, I'm always interested in how qualitative research on sexual minority health helps us to reveal what are the roles of these other social institutions and the current community discourse about what we are finding about those populations. And then what are the prospective health outlooks on marginalized communities or from those communities, right? How do they see their lives being played out in the data? I also think that qualitative sexual minority data can help us to understand the unintended impacts of quantitative data on populations. So what is their perspective on the data that we find, right? So now that I've told you, you have a 1 in 2 chance, what does that mean with what you'll do? Does it change who you will want to date or how you think about what it will mean for you to actually avoid HIV? What else is going on in your life besides HIV, which is a question I'm always thinking about, especially because Black men in particular have been pathologized in that way. And fundamentally, what are those behavioral shifts or the lack thereof that we can track from a qualitative perspective? So I really think about what is that connection and that relationship between, now that we publish these wonderful statistics, what happens in the community when they get a hold of it, right? Because sometimes we're not in the room to help them process what we found. And so I'm going to end there. Thank you all so much.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me, and thanks, Christopher, for your leadership in the Office of the Population Research at Princeton for hosting this. 70 years ago, the Population Council was conceived to be at Princeton. So I feel a little bit of kinship being in this quaint little university in New Jersey, coming from New York City. I come to demography, I won't tell you when, it's been a while, really looking at fertility pattern globally. So I'm just so inspired all morning, sitting here, listening to a new generation of thinkers who are looking at different aspects of demography, which I am so inspired by. And I'm just really here to learn a lot from you. I'm the only non-academic who presenting today, so I'm clearly not good at staying in my lane. And I'm not writing a book, so I'm not pitching for any book here. But it's really just sharing with you our collection of work on queer-led research at the Population Council, really bringing in a global perspective more than what we have heard here today. We heard some stuff in Japan, but it's still a high-income country. So my presentation will really focus on low- and middle-income countries. The work that I'm going to share is some of my work, but most of it is led by colleagues across the council in collaboration with our partners. So I hope to be able to represent them. I will first share the progress made in survey research, particularly among young people, but also major gaps that we are seeing in low- and middle-income countries. I will share how we use a community-driven approach to really centering the voice and the experience of queer community in our work. And how do we do that in the Global South, as well as translating some of that work into the Global North. And then I'll share some reflection of the state of queer demography toward the end. So for those of you who are not familiar with the Population Council, we are an international research organization. We conduct research, develop solutions to really uplift the lives of marginalized community, and LGBTQI community is part of it. Beyond making sure that our work is rigorous and published in peer-reviewed journals, we work with government, private sectors, and nonprofit actors to translate the work for policy, for programming, and for investment to serve community more effectively around the world. So an example of this is that more than 2 decades ago, the Council was the first organization that conducted a large-scale research with MSM, men who have sex with men in Africa, through our Horizon project that was funded by the US government. And while Gary talked about how there were a lot of advocacy for gay men in the United States, the epidemic was rampant in the global south, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. Completely ignored, no data. So prior to 2000, that wasn't a long time ago. There were a couple of ethnographic studies among this population. They were great study, but they were not able to move the lever to make sure that the MSM are seen, but also they are prioritized in HIV prevention program. So without a population-based survey, we were not able to quantify or characterize risk behaviors, sexual behaviors among this population. And then in this background, entrenched homophobia make it much more difficult for policymakers and researchers to identify them. So we use a mixed method strategy to really identify this population and really placing the MSM community, really working closely with them to figure out how to recruit and collect data from them. So the evidence generated by this study in Senegal and Kenya have really moved the lever in both of those countries across the continent, but other worked on this population and particularly in the HIV epidemic. So, because I think the impact is quite incredible, so I just want to share some of it. The directors of National AIDS Commission in Senegal and the National AIDS Control Council in Kenya finally, after this study published, acknowledged the existence of MSM. And then the council and our partner worked together with these authorities to really uplift inclusive policy in HIV prevention program, making sure that they are part of program implementation, research design moving forward. And it has been a great sort of journey to see many people have uptake this work and included in their research and in their programming. So with a gender inclusive equity lens in all of our work, the council seeks to advance 4 interconnected goals: sexual reproductive health and rights and choice, empower the largest generation of adolescents to reach their full potential, achieve gender equity, and pursue climate justice. So our work span across 14 countries with research study and innovation in 30 countries, and it blend and use an interdisciplinary approach of public health research, social science, as well as biomedical research. Not only we work within this area, but we really see this area as a response to some of the global crises or global shifts, such as aging, climate crisis, urbanization, technological innovation. So the Population Council queer-led research focus on really 3 main areas: reduction of stigma and discrimination, so working on the upstream, really focus on health and well-being, with a particular emphasis on sexual health and HIV prevention. So we employ a community-driven approach that to gather data, generate evidence and solution with 3 sort of like area of focus. Prioritize LGBTQ plus leadership. So making sure that they are involved in every stage of the research, including before we develop a proposal to work with them, making sure that, so I'll share some of how we do that, because I think that's really a much more equitable way of conducting research, challenging the paradigm of the power of academia, research, and the study participant. The second is to really foster collaboration effort with locally rooted LGBTQ plus organization, key opinion leaders, community advisory group, really building trust so that the data that are going to be generated from this project can be directly translated into policy and et cetera that I mentioned previously. And then the third is that we use community-driven methodologies such as participatory research, peer-led intervention research, community-based approach, and really thinking about letting the community define the objective of study, the measurement, and etc. And I will share some of that work. So as I mentioned, one of my area of work is focusing on the rising generation of 1.8 billion adolescent and young people. 90% of the 1.8 billion is in the global south. While much of the work on queer youth are really focused on the global north. So if you can take away anything today, I would hope that we can kind of think about the global queer adolescent and young people moving forward, and not just those are in Western country or in the global north. So we published these two scoping review led by queer researchers. One of them is Jessica DeMoto, who's in the room today. And I'll just focus on the plus one study. We only found 32 articles that they all, and the majority of them are from higher middle income countries, very few from low middle income country. The majority of them are in Asia, particularly Southeast Asia. They focus on three main topics: sexual health, mental health, and violence. And the majority of them use network-driven sampling. The key takeaway for me is that most of these studies were done in countries where same-sex relations are illegal. So I want you to know that conducting this research is possible. Many researchers make excuses, oh, it's difficult and culturally sensitive. Based on this body of work, it is possible. However, our review kind of highlight a couple of things. So a lot of these studies are at small scale. They are not representative. And while I think small scale studies are important and they bring out a lot of community voices, it's very hard to change in national policy. So there's a need to really focus on large scale survey. And then a lot of the study do not contain a lot of methodology on how they measure gender identity, sexual orientation, and etc. So I would encourage that scholar, when we are working on this issue, we would describe our methodology like today, it's great so that other people can learn from them. Because often, if you are not queer and you are doing this type of research, because a lot of non-queer researchers are leading this work, so that can be very daunting for them. So how do we sort of change that a little bit to provide some of that stuff? A lot of this study did not include LGBTQ plus young people as voices in their work. So I would say encourage that researchers thinking about working with queer youth, that they are thinking about some of this work. I'm going to shift gear now to talk about how we do some of this work as we respond to crises. Jessica DeMoto and colleagues published this commentary early on in the pandemic, talking about the need to prioritize queer youth in light of crises. They talk about three things: pre-pandemic risks like bullying, violence, and substance abuse were compounded by the pandemic, which exacerbate disparity for this population. And often, lockdown orders during the pandemic can also disrupt social services, which make this population much more invisible. And then there's a lack of data in the public health response when it comes to gender minority groups. So during the pandemic, we collaborate with Think Global Health to put out a series of data in terms of looking at data equity that we were calling it. But also we were advising government around the world to how to respond to the pandemic. And the major takeaway here is that gender data were completely lacking. And even for progressive states and cities like New York City, LA, and Los Angeles, while they claim to have this data, they will not publish or share, and would make it really difficult for practitioner, for researcher, for advocate to advocate for more equitable response during the pandemic. And one thing to take away from this is that administrative data that we haven't talked about that today. Administrative data is very powerful because that's when policymakers and people who are making decision on where to put health or social program, they use that data much more than the research data. And if gender data is lacking, people become much more invisible. So how are we respond to crises and thinking about gender data? So in 2020, we launched an online survey in Mexico. We call it Voces, which means voices, and really focus on thinking about, can we actually capture LGBTQ plus youth and their vulnerability during the pandemic? So Voces is a large-scale online survey that reached about 150,000 adolescent and young people. About 2% of the study population were genderqueer. That's how they describe it. There's many findings, such as mental health, for instance, was very high among genderqueer youth compared to their cisgender peer. But what I really think about the takeaway from this is that this is when we were all online, right? And we were not leaving our house. So I thought this sort of like word cloud was really great because it's also providing a space for young people to say, thank you for doing this. I really appreciate, that somebody is listening to me. And it go back to that commentary that Jessica DeMoto was talking about, is that this population feel completely invisible during crises. The cool thing about Voces is that it's an online survey, it's open cohort, it captures LGBTQ youth. So it's allowed you to look at different crises all at once. So we recently published this paper in Scientific Reports looking at the compounding effect of the pandemic as well as the climate crisis. So we found that the poorest and queer youth were the hardest hit. About 3 in 4 exposed to flooding event, hurricane, storm, or drought, or heat wave. And it's made their lives much more difficult. So the takeaway here for me is that I want all of us, when we're working in demography or social issue or health, we gotta think about this crises. I'm really worried about the rising generation growing up in a very uncertain world. And I haven't heard the word climate crisis at all today. And this is the future that we have built for them. So I really think that this is something that, as we think about, because it's going to affect family composition, migration pattern, fertility choice moving forward. So not just queer demographer, but demographer at large need to think about this issue much more holistically. I also want to mention another crisis that I thought an inspiration from Voces is that we were so successful capturing this data online. So we also implemented with Asian Americans youth in the United States. And we were also able to capture the study sample was about 7% of queer youth participate in that study. I'm going to move a little bit faster to really thinking about this one area of work. It's All Health Matter. All Health Matter is led by Drexel University. It's run by my colleagues in India, and it uses research data and community knowledge to develop policy and social relevant survey. So I want to emphasize 3 things here. What I really love about this work is that they have set up a transmasculine steering committee, and researchers collaborate with Park Council, Harvard, and Drexel University. So they decide on the objective of the study by centering transmasculine community. They also work with transmasculine community, such as Trans Men Collective and Tweet Foundation, to thinking about measurement that are much more relevant to them. So they decide to focus on family rejection, violence, and resilience, and not so much about like health risks and etc. More macro issue. And then working directly with this community and letting them lead this work has really resulted in better recruitment strategy. Because one of the challenges that we all have when working with marginalized communities is recruitment. And because of the robust network that they have, they were able to help with recruitment strategy that were higher than expected. I'm gonna skip through this thing. This is another example of how we work with clinics to really kind of think about how we prioritize transgender women, and then really talk about some of the work that we have translate from the global South into the global North a little bit. Thank you. So this work here was adapted from some of our work in sub-Saharan Africa, Tanzania. Particularly, we work with sex worker in Tanzania, female sex worker, to put together a community approach that we test to randomized control trial, and that show that they have high uptake in prevention measure as well as treatment measure. And I think PrEP is a very common thing here in the United States or in Europe. PrEP is not highly uptake for women in sub-Saharan Africa. So we thought that was a great example. We have able to be done at RCT. So we translate that work into working with Black sexual minority men in Washington, D.C., which, as you all know, have the highest rate of HIV in the United States. And this work is, this work was done with us, helping us. And we are now at a pilot phase, but it's really thinking about how do we get access to PrEP. And PrEP for Blacks, sexual minority men in Washington, D.C. is quite low compared to the nation. So we are thinking about access to pharmacy, but also community health services as well. And we're developing it with them, and we hope to kind of also evaluate through a randomized control evaluation. So I want to share, besides doing research, we also produce, all of our data is open access, but I want to share two resources that might be relevant to your work. The first is Rethinking Sexuality Education Project, and now it's all one curriculum. And it's promote a paradigm shift in the sexuality education field, and really thinking about the intersections between gender, power, relationship, and rights for young people. And this work is used in 100 countries, it's used across the LA and San Francisco school system, it's used by UN agency and government curriculum as large. The other thing is the gender and power metric database. We're actually updating it right now, but it's publicly accessible. It's combined measurement across study globally to really thinking about how do we measure gender better. And as we are updating this with Johns Hopkins University, we are thinking about a more inclusive and gender sensitive measurement within this, this new database. So in summary, I think more research could integrate insight and perspective from queer population. While I think it's need to be done in a cultural, legal, and political context, I hope I can demonstrate it to people online and in the room. It is possible to do it even at a small scale. We need to learn how we work with queer population globally. And then often, I work globally, I work in the US, and I work across the world. Often when I talk to folks, both researcher, practitioner, and policymaker here, it's very us and them. And I really hope that I can demonstrate to you today that there's a lot of lessons learned that we can take from the global South to global North. Not only research methodologies, but also intervention design and evaluation design. And I hope that the next Queer Demography Summit will have more folks from the global South. Yeah, I think that's the vision that Chris also had. And then as a queer researcher, and I really think about, I use the demographic health survey a lot and the mixed health survey a lot. They are very behind. I think my DHS colleague might be online on and sexual orientation. So I would challenge them to really, they are thinking about doing this work better. The DHS is powerful. The mixed survey is powerful. It's used to design program, policy, move funding to invest in queer population, to invest in population overall. But it's still very binary in its nature. And it's in an experimental stage where the DHS only have about 10 countries that thinking about some of this measurement. So I hope in that endeavor, queer researchers are at the forefront of it, but also but also that queer population are consulted and thinking more innovatively on how we do this work. So I just want to say that from Uganda to the US to Ghana, we see anti-LGBTQ law being implemented, threatening the well-being of queer folks all around the world. And as a queer researcher, I really think that the best way to influence policy is through provision of unbiased data so that advocates, policymakers, and practitioners can use that data and move the lever to make queer population more visible and to build more inclusive policy. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I want to start by thanking Christopher for organizing this summit and thanking the panelists in this panel and throughout the day for really transforming how we think about a lot of these questions. I'm Elizabeth Armstrong. I'm on the faculty here in the Office of Population Research, in sociology, and in the School of Public and International Affairs. I'm trained as a demographer and a medical sociologist. Shockingly, I think I'm actually one of the elder demographers in the room at this point. And as a medical sociologist, I've always been attentive to how we know what we think we know. That's not a dimension that demography is particularly well known for. But I start with the notion that objectivity is illusory, that reality is socially constructed, and that knowledge is always partial and evolving. And I see that as being foundational to much of the work that critical queer demography is doing, so I am here for it. I'd like to pick up on one big idea or insight from each of the three presentations that we just heard, and then broaden a little bit to think about the implications for demography. So starting with Jamie Budnick's presentation, I found very powerful the claim that surveys reflect and shape the world that they measure, and that they teach respondents how to think about these questions. Budnick's encourages us to rehabilitate, as it were, the health frame and the charm circle that so often dominate work by demographers or have dominated work by demographers to date. Her rehabilitation of these questions leads her to what she calls productive problems. And I found these really interesting, these research gaps or omissions as opportunities to fundamentally rethink the questions we are asking and how we ask them. So as a researcher who studies abortion, I found really powerful her insight that when we prioritize privacy in the way we ask questions about people's experiences, we inadvertently generate stigma or contribute to the production of stigma. Likewise, when we frame health as being fundamentally about being at risk, we also generate stigma and shame around people's behaviors. Winder picks up on a lot of the same ideas and powerfully reminds us that published data and statistics tell people what to think about themselves. They don't merely reflect reality. They also, again, as Budnick suggests, are telling people how to think about their reality. This is a really powerful insight, and it suggests that as demographers, we are doing more than measuring reality. Demographers think of ourselves as being primarily about measurement. But these papers, in particular, Winder's presentation really did this for me, demonstrated that we are constructing reality, not just measuring it. Now, I know that won't come as a surprise to any sociologists of knowledge, but that's definitely a more radical idea for demographers to grapple with. And the kind of surveillance mentality that we so often bring to our work is another way in which how we think about measurement is actually constructing a lived reality for certain particularly minoritized and stigmatized populations. Winder emphasizes that research can create, not only that research can create reality on the ground, but also that we need to look beyond individual behaviors and individuals as agents of their own health outcomes through their behaviors, but to consider social context, societal institutions, and cultural beliefs, values, and norms as determinants of population health. That is, population health is not merely an aggregation of individual health behaviors, but also is a powerful reflection of these cultural beliefs. And no takes us even further by encouraging us to really think about the idea of inclusive research, of blurring the lines between the researcher and the researched, by affording subjects agency over the questions that we ask and answer. In other words, taking seriously the idea of people we research as subjects rather than as objects, and as collaborators in generating research questions. So the community-driven approaches that No describes depend on a partnership at every stage of research design, research conduct, and research dissemination. And I think Winder in many ways is calling for the same kind of partnership here. All of these papers also call our attention to different axes of invisibility and to the ways in which this is not just about intersectionality, but about compounding effects of different kinds of identities. I think each of these scholars pushes us to think about research as relational and to start by seeing the world through the eyes of the people that we study. And that this relational dynamic is really a fundamental restructuring of how we think about the work that we do as demographers. I think two things follow, or a couple of things follow from this. First is that including queer and gender variant people and experiences in research is not the same as not excluding them. That to truly include them doesn't mean just to add some questions that acknowledge their existence, but to really think about what are the questions that are specific to the lived experience of people with gender variant and queer identities. And to ask those questions in value neutral ways, which, as all of these presentations have shown us, is not an easy or obvious thing to do. So I think in other words, the myths, misperceptions, and mistakes that Gary Gates spoke about earlier this morning are both mistakes of omission and mistakes of commission on the part of demographers and other social scientists. And that led me to wonder, how did demographers end up excluding so much from their measurement of human behavior? And I think here we have to just take a brief historical tour and consider that there are really only 4 core concepts at the heart of classical demography: fertility, mortality, nuptiality, and migration. So at the dawn of this discipline, 2 of these, births and marriage, were inconceivable outside of heterosexual patriarchy. In other words, outside of the charm circle that Budnick borrows from Rubin. So the reason that demographers have sort of excluded so much other behavior is because they've been focused on these outcomes, on outcomes of marriage and outcomes of birth, in addition to outcomes of mortality and migration. Health and aging were not part of kind of classic traditional demography. So really this is about broadening the field as well. So the outcomes that we were interested were shaping the questions that we asked and the people we considered relevant to study. Okay, so let me just reflect a little bit on some of what I take away from these presentations. First, the questions that we ask not only generate reality, but also important to consider is how we ask the questions and who asks the questions. We need representation on both sides of the research relationship. I think this room reflects that importance, and the papers that we just heard reflects that. Stigma is a powerful barrier both to healthcare services, as Winder shows us, but also to knowledge. We can't document what we can't see. And so I want to end with a reflection on the interrelated concepts of invisibility, visibility, hypervisibility, and silence. Silence and invisibility are forms of erasure and elision, but how are they alike and how are they different? How is visibility different than voice? And I would argue that we need both voice and visibility to rehabilitate demographic research and consider a full range of human population behavior. I also think it's worth noting that silence and invisibility are sometimes historically and still in the present survival mechanisms for minoritized and stigmatized populations, but they can be significant barriers to accurate description of the social world and to the construction of social science and social science knowledge and theory. Voice and visibility are both causes and consequences of expanding social science knowledge in the way that the panelists that we just heard from have called upon us to do. And I would just conclude by noting that I think widening the lens in the way we are empowered to do by these presentations can enrich demography, not just queer demography. So there's a lot here that's generalizable, not only in terms of knowledge and tools and methods, but in terms of how we conceptualize human behaviors and human variation in populations. So I want to thank the panelists for a really generative and rich set of papers.
Hi again, everyone. I want to start off by thanking Betsy for such excellent comments. And our panelists once more for their presentations. I feel like these are really hard to follow. But here we go. So as I listened to our panelists present, I kept thinking about how research is an iterative process, right? Not only are we cycling between the literature, our hypotheses, and our findings, but research itself cycles back and forth between academia and the real world. Our work impacts people, and people impact our work. Jamie kicked off this panel making precisely this point, that surveys reflect the world they measure, but they shape it too. This is a lot of power to hold, and as she said prior, we do not have the tools to truly measure queerness in full. Our demographic capture questions are complicated by authorized vocabulary and respectability politics, which we know are never in favor of the expansiveness of what it means to be queer. They are focused on risks associated with being queer, which reinforces a history of stigma, or they are performative, and that's just reductive and simply disrespectful. Terrell shows us what the impact of non-comprehensive research, or as Jamie calls it, productive problems, look like on the ground. In his ethnographic work, gay, bi, and pan-Black men intentionally seek out support group meetings where they're able to discuss the challenges of intersectional stigma and bring unspoiled imaginaries to life. They trace the stigma and the fear that they have back to statistics and norms that they or others have heard and internalized about being queer, about being Black and queer. Pearl also shows an interesting dynamic where religion can both oppress and empower folks. I think this highlights how decolonial practices, whether religious, racial, sexuality-based, or a mix of all the above and others, can provide support for folks who provide the support folks need and do not otherwise get, because colonial institutions were never made to support them. Knowing how our work impacts people, Why closes this panel by showing how people impact our work. The projects he highlighted intentionally integrate queer leadership in all phases of the research process, whether through hiring and promoting queer leaders in our organizations or teaming up with locally rooted LGBTQ+ communities. When we center queer voices, our work better reflects community priorities and realities. He also reminds us that the queer agenda is a global agenda. There are folks all around the world working in pursuit of queer equity. Queer health has long been studied, but we know that it is not enough to simply do so. Our queer community faces too much violence systemically and interpersonally for that. It is our responsibility to study queer health comprehensively and authentically, because queer health is more than binary identity survey questions, statistics of riskiness, or even prevention programs, right? Queer health is caring for the whole queer person and understanding how queerness complements other salient identities. As a queer grad student, it feels easy sometimes to feel small and overwhelmed by the way things are compared to the ways that I would like things to be. But just like the research process and research itself, change is also iterative. It involves us doing good work and sharing good work and supporting each other as we continue to think and learn and grow. Jamie, Terrell, and Bly have made it clear that things are changing, and they are three of many of the folks here that are doing the work to change things. Today's summit is proof that things are changing too. My biggest hope is that we come away from today feeling fulfilled and inspired to pursue queer liberation in the best way we know how, with our research and with each other. Thank you.
But yeah, so questions for the panelists.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you all so much. My question is for Twy. I'm deeply moved by your call for us to really foreground the climate crisis. And I was wondering about, and I've asked this of my colleagues before who are also rightly calling for us, like the urgency of addressing this. But when I ask my colleagues, you know, how does gender, expansive notions of gender or sexuality inform the climate crisis, or how does the climate crisis inform gender and sexuality? I haven't gotten a very detailed response. It's more like you should just study the climate crisis. So I was wondering if you could talk about the specific processes that you're imagining will be impacted or that are being impacted by it.
And then Christina, do you want to read the online question for Jamie?
Yeah, so Jamie, you got the question. Can you give a small note about the evolution and gender?
And then we'll do one more question. Yeah.
So thank you all for your presentation. So I have a question that sort of I think applies to all presenters, but a bit differently to each, which is actually about the word queer. That sort of brings us today here. So for example, in Terrell's presentation, you mentioned how the word queer itself was sort of not, embraced by the participants in your work. In the Population Council work, we see queer as an umbrella term that's used to refer to many different groups and populations. And then in survey work, we also see how queer appears as genderqueer, as in many ways it shows up in open-ended responses. And thinking how central queer has become as a word to sort of encompass this kind of work in conversations. How do you see it playing out in practice in demographic work that you're carrying out, either through surveys or through interviews? Because we see it used as a gender identity category, sometimes as just a descriptor, sometimes as sexual orientation, sometimes as a field of study. So just in practice, when you are either working in the US or abroad, translation is a challenge, pretty much just an open-ended question regarding your work of how do you address, handle, and sort of introduce the actual word queer in this kind of work.
Okay, so let's start with you, Jamie. There's a down the line.
Okay, is this on? All right, I can't really hear it from my perspective. Okay, those are great questions. Thank you so much. And I can't wait to hear some answers about climate because I have them too. And I think that's something we should all be carrying with us into lunch as we continue discussion. I have some ideas too.
Please.
It's so much. But for the questions for me, I love that I got this one because I have worried the online question about how does a measurement of trans overlap, because I've worried in not publishing my book since graduating in 2020, maybe I shouldn't have just done my dissertation focusing on the measurement of sexual orientation. Everything's changed in the last decade. Things have moved really fast. And I've talked to colleagues about maybe the book project has to change. Maybe I have to expand and include this entire, everything about sexuality and gender, overlaps and conversations between them, and it's been paralyzing in honesty. I want to share that. And I want to thank my new friend and colleague Dara for encouraging me to say there's other people doing great research on trans. Maybe there's something you could bring to the table that is my dissertation was narrowly focused on these sexual identity, attraction, and behavior categories. And what I like about the focus on those is there's this rich world of analysis of the interplay between the three, whether we expect them to line up. What do we call it when they don't? There's this whole world in psychology about convergence and divergence. And so I'm really interested in that and how that creates new types of people. MSM, are men who have sex with men, are essentially people who don't have convergence between the behavior, identity, and attraction measures. And when demographers have added sexuality in this way, they often do so by thinking of those three measures. So that's what I have focused on. But I recognize the overlap in measuring trans. There's a whole literature that's really focused on testing experimental measures, thinking about the history of terminology. My paper with Laurel Westbrook and Aaliyah Saperstein looks at the highly gendered language throughout surveys, a whole world of brothers, sisters, mothers, fathers, gendered sexual activity, the examples I gave about expectations about crime. Gender pervades all the other topics that we ask about. So that's a background there. And I think I would just encourage looking to that literature too. To say a quick note about queer, Professor Winder, I find the same thing when I talk to young non-hetero women. They're using terms like bisexual because queer is something they haven't heard in their everyday life. My perception is that it's a very college women's studies term, and that maybe the youth right now are like it's sweeping and becoming something new. But we did our dissertation work, I think, in the same years, and it was a very classed phenomenon, is what I was finding.
No, I would add to that. I think it's a great question about queer. I think across my different projects, queer comes up differently. And so in that project, at least for the Black men in Los Angeles, no one used the word queer during the project. It didn't come up at all. Now, in the ATR project I've been working with, queer has come up a few times and people are more readily doing that. I also think that has to do with gender as well, that has maybe 14 cisgender men in the entire project across the 109 interviews. So more people are using the term queer in that way. But I also think there's something about language in general, and it's the constant tug back and forth between like what does queer actually mean. And so 2 points about that. So like one is I think historically this larger reflection on what is the gay rights movement or the queer rights movement. We think of it that way, that like, are we saying we deserve rights because we're different, or we deserve rights because we're the same? And I think for a lot of people, queer meant different. And a lot of my projects, people are saying, we're not different, we are the same, right? Because that's been the large thrust of why people deserve rights in this country. Like, we're just like you, we can have families, we can be in the military, that kind of fun stuff. But I also think, the constant kind of like push and pull with language is not just queer. I remember one of the first papers that I tried to get published, one of the terms that came up in my project a lot was lifestyle, because a lot of the men I talked to in interview talked about living a gay lifestyle. And to them, that meant something different. But trying to get something published that said gay lifestyle was insane. Like people were like, what are you doing? You're trying to reverse the whole field. You've gotten so far away from lifestyles. It's not a lifestyle. And I'm like, no, but this is what people are saying in my work. And so I think we have this constant tension between what researchers are finding linguistically as what they want to advance and what people are actually using on the ground. And it works both ways. So even when you brought up MSM, right, as a category, I had people who would say, I identify as MSM because they didn't want to associate with the word gay or something like that, right? So it's working in both ways. I think it's changing, right? And in this generation, I'm always interested to see like how over time does queer become a term that's more accepted because people are starting to say we're different and that's okay, or if it becomes a term that people are just using as an umbrella term because they felt like as they call it, alphabet soup has gotten too long, right? And it's just easy to go to.
I'll add a little bit on how practically we do it. I really love what Daithi and Sorel said today. And I think I would never use the word queer when I work with the population that we seek to serve in, say, Tanzania or Kenya. You know, I think MSN is still a lot of there's many feelings about issue with that terminology, but that's what the population choose to use. And I would say that the practicality of how we do that work and through the All Health Matter project that I would illustrate is that when you ask the community, what is it that they want to be identified by, how do they want to be their gender or sexual orientation, that's how it will work. Because I think Nike was said it nicely this morning is that gender is not a concept that is we use in our culture. I'm also Buddhist, so I don't really. And pronouns, another issue, like, oh my God, I grew up with so many pronouns. I have a pronoun for my aunt who's on my mom's side versus my aunt on my dad's side. This is not, so I think a community-driven approach to do it. While I want to counteract it with another issue that I talked to somebody here today is that I think the comparative research to DHS or the mixed survey is very important because it moves levels. And I wouldn't say that shy away from experimenting with some of the measurement, both on gender identity and sexual orientation, so that we can see. And I hope that it's an iterative approach. It's a survey. You can delete that question and change it whenever. It's not carved in stone. And I don't know why we get stuck in this. We need to use our queer brain a little bit more fluidly. And then I'm gonna get to the climate crisis. So for me is that the climate crisis is any other crisis and that often marginalize poor people of intersecting marginalizations, women and girls and queer populations, or sexual gender minority or MSM, because these people are also experiencing marginalization already. And when a pandemic hit or a crisis hit, they are experiencing at the compounding effect, right? So I would say that for me in how to do it is that I would say first is one is that you have to include queer folks in your survey. So we try to do that with the VOCIS survey. We were like, well, we should ask questions about, it's not like we wake up every day and we do this in the past. But at that time I was like, well, queer folks are being marginalized during the pandemic, we should ask it. And then I'm like, oh my gosh, Mexico is probably one of the most climate prone country in the world. Why haven't we asked questions about the climate crisis? So we start asking questions about experiencing climatic events like flooding, like heat waves, and etc. And really looking at like some of the outcome, health or social or economic outcome. So just really understand what is this population is feeling, And then I think one of the things that we at health researcher, also scientists or demographer, kind of get scared about this work. And because we interdisciplinary, we work with climate scientists, and they push back with me. They're like, well, what do you want to measure in climate when you talk about health? What do you want to measure when you talk about gender? Because they have been really focused on emission pattern, weather events, etc. And I think as demographers, we have to bring the people lens to them. And I think we have to be iterative in this process in working on climate. And that's what I would encourage, because you can't rely on climate scientists to kind of wake up and think about gender, think about people, think about health, because that's not their training. But I think how do we create a system that all can work together? And I think in many ways, I just came back from London to meet with some folks who work on climate, and they were like, you need to stop asking climate people to fund your health work. And I'm like, wow, you are right. Because we at researchers who focus on this work need to integrate climate into our work, because they have all the issues to solve, and I thought that was revealing, because I keep pushing the climate space to think about this, but then I'm like, oh, well, I haven't thought about climate in a thoughtful way on how I integrate my work. So I think it's new for everybody. So I would encouraging that violence is a major issue with the climate crisis, right? For women and girls and gender minorities.